The first time Elena Rodriguez felt true pain, she was 7 years old. Not the scrape your knee kind of pain that children experience daily, but the kind that reshapes your understanding of the world. She had reached into her abuela's kitchen cabinet without permission, searching for the dulce de leche cookies she knew were hidden there. Instead, her small fingers found the scorching metal handle of a pot recently removed from the stove. As tears streamed down her face, her grandmother wrapped her burned hand in a cool, damp cloth and whispered, "Remember this feeling, Mija. Pain teaches us what words cannot." At the time, Elena didn't understand that this moment would become the first paragraph in a much longer story about pain, learning, and what it means to be human. 20 years later, Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood in her laboratory at the Universidad Nacional de Mexico, observing the neural patterns displayed on her monitor. The colorful waves pulsed across the screen as her research subject, a young woman named Lucia, recalled her most painful memory. Elena had spent the past decade developing a controversial theory that humanity's unique relationship with pain had catalyzed our evolution in ways no other species experienced. While animals learned to avoid painful situations through simple conditioning, humans transformed pain into art, science, philosophy, and growth. Her research was about to challenge everything the scientific community understood about human consciousness, but first, she needed to prove that we truly were the only species that learned from pain rather than merely avoiding it. So, you're saying that pain is good for us? Professor Carlos Mendez leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. The departmental meeting had been going for nearly an hour, and Elena's presentation had clearly made her colleagues uncomfortable. "Not exactly," Elena replied, tapping her tablet to advance to the next slide. "I'm saying that our response to pain, physical, emotional, and existential, is uniquely human. Animals feel pain and learn to avoid it, but humans incorporate pain into our understanding of ourselves and the world." The slide showed brain scans of various mammals experiencing pain, rats, monkeys, dogs, compared with human subjects. "Look at these neural pathways," she continued, using her laser pointer to highlight specific regions. "In all mammals, pain activates the amygdala and triggers the fight-or-flight response. But only in humans do we see simultaneous activation in the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and language centers. We don't just feel pain, we analyze it, contextualize it, create narratives around it, and extract meaning from it." Professor Mendez shook his head. "Elena, this is interesting but speculative. How can you measure meaning extraction in a laboratory setting? And what does this have to do with your request for expanded human trials?" Elena took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been preparing for. Her funding, her lab, her entire career might depend on the next few minutes. "I've developed a new methodology that combines neural imaging with linguistic analysis," she explained. "By asking subjects to describe their painful experiences while we monitor their brain activity, we can map the neurological pathways of pain processing and meaning-making in real time." She advanced to the final slide, a proposed study involving 500 participants across different cultures, ages, and backgrounds. "If my theory is correct, we'll see consistent patterns in how humans transform pain into learning, regardless of cultural context. And if we can understand this process better..." She paused, looking each committee member in the eye. "We may be able to help people who are trapped in cycles of trauma and suffering." The room fell silent. Elena knew that several committee members had experienced personal tragedies, a son lost to addiction, a spouse with chronic illness. She wasn't trying to manipulate them emotionally, but she needed them to understand the real-world implications of her work. Finally, Dr. Gabriela Santos, the department chair, spoke. "Your proposal has merit, Dr. Rodriguez. But there are serious ethical concerns about deliberately evoking painful memories in research subjects. The committee will need time to consider your request." Elena nodded. It wasn't a no. It was a start. As the meeting dispersed, she gathered her materials, her mind already racing with refinements to her methodology. She didn't notice Professor Mendez approaching until he was right beside her. "Elena," he said quietly, "there's something you should know. There's someone else interested in your research. Someone outside the university." Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" "I received a call yesterday from a company called NeuroSynth. They've been following your publications and want to discuss potential applications." NeuroSynth. Elena had never heard of them. They're a biotech startup focused on neural interfaces. Very well funded, very secretive, and very interested in how humans process pain. He hesitated. "Just be careful who you share your findings with. Not everyone has the same ethical considerations as academia." With that cryptic warning, he walked away, leaving Elena with a strange feeling of unease that would soon prove to be justified. Lucia Vega sat perfectly still in the examination chair, electrodes attached to her temples and chest. The monitoring equipment hummed softly in the background as Elena adjusted the final settings. "Are you comfortable?" Elena asked, her voice gentle. Subject comfort was essential for accurate readings. Lucia nodded, though her clenched hands betrayed her nervousness. "Yes, doctor. I'm ready." Elena sat across from her, tablet in hand. "Remember, you can stop at any time. Just say the word." "I understand." "Good. Let's begin." Elena tapped the recording icon. "Please state your name and consent for the record." "My name is Lucia Vega. I consent to participate in this study examining neural responses to painful memories." "Thank you, Lucia. Now we'll start with some simple questions to establish baseline readings." Elena watched the neural activity display calibrate. "What did you have for breakfast today?" "Coffee and a torta with egg and chorizo." "What's your favorite color?" "Blue." "Dark blue, like the ocean at night." The questions continued for several minutes, gradually becoming more personal but still emotionally neutral. Lucia's readings remained stable, exactly what Elena hoped for. "You're doing great," Elena said. "Now we're going to move to the core of our study. I'd like you to recall a painful experience from your past. It can be physical or emotional pain. Take your time." Lucia closed her eyes. The monitors showed increased activity in her limbic system, the emotional center of the brain. "When I was 16, she began slowly. My father died in a car accident. He was driving home from work. It was raining." Her voice trembled slightly. "A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel and crossed into his lane." On the monitor, Elena watched as Lucia's brain lit up like a constellation. The pain centers activated first, followed by memory retrieval, and then, most interestingly, the prefrontal cortex, where higher reasoning occurred. "Can you tell me what you were feeling when you learned about the accident?" Elena asked softly. "It was like..." Lucia paused, searching for words. "Like the world stopped making sense. Like everything I knew was suddenly wrong. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mother told me, and I remember screaming, but it felt like someone else was screaming through my body." The neural patterns shifted again. Now language centers were engaging, working to translate raw emotion into coherent narrative. "And in the years since then, how has this experience affected you?" This was the crucial question, the one that separated human pain processing from animal responses. Lucia was quiet for so long that Elena wondered if she should repeat the question. "Then, it changed everything. At first, I was angry at the truck driver, at God, at the world. I stopped going to school. I started drinking. I was trying to make the pain stop." She opened her eyes, looking directly at Elena. "But then something happened. I realized that the pain wasn't going away, so I had to learn to carry it." On the monitor, Elena saw exactly what she had predicted: the integration of emotional pain processing with higher cognitive functions, creating new neural pathways. "I started volunteering at a traffic safety organization," Lucia continued. "I spoke at schools about the dangers of driving while tired. I helped other families who lost people to accidents. And somehow, the pain, it didn't disappear, but it transformed. It became something useful, something that connected me to others instead of isolating me. Elena tried to maintain her professional demeanor, but she couldn't help feeling moved. This was exactly the process her theory described, the uniquely human ability to metabolize pain into meaning.
Thank you, Lucia.
That's incredibly helpful. She began removing the electrodes. We'll take a break now, and she was interrupted by the sound of the laboratory door opening. Dr. Santos stepped in, accompanied by a man Elena didn't recognize, tall, expensively dressed, with a confident bearing of someone used to getting what he wanted. Dr. Rodriguez, Santos said, her expression tense. I apologize for interrupting. This is Mr. James Harrington from NeuroSynth. He's very interested in your research and insisted on observing today's session. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. This was not protocol. No outside observers had been approved for this study. Dr. Santos, this is highly irregular. My subject has not consented to additional observers. The man, Harrington, smiled apologetically, but his eyes remained cold, assessing. My sincere apologies, Dr. Rodriguez. I wouldn't normally intrude, but what you're doing here is, well, it's revolutionary. Our company is prepared to offer substantial funding to support the expansion of your research. Lucia looked confused and uncomfortable. Elena turned to her immediately. Lucia, you're free to go. The session is over for today. My assistant will process your compensation on the way out. After Lucia had left, Elena turned to the unwelcome visitors, her anger barely contained. What exactly is going on here? Who authorized this? Dr. Santos looked uncomfortable. The university is considering a partnership with NeuroSynth. Their resources could significantly advance our research capabilities. At what cost? Elena asked sharply. Harrington stepped forward. Dr. Rodriguez, I understand your concern, but perhaps we could discuss this more privately? He glanced pointedly at Dr. Santos, who took the hint. I'll leave you two to talk, she said, retreating quickly. Once they were alone, Harrington's demeanor changed subtly, less apologetic, more direct. Your work on pain processing and human consciousness is groundbreaking, he said. But I believe you're only seeing a fraction of its potential applications. And what applications are you imagining, Mr. Harrington? Elena asked coolly. Therapeutic interventions for PTSD. Enhanced learning protocols. Pain management techniques unlike anything currently available. He paused. And yes, potential military and intelligence applications. There it was. The real agenda. You want to weaponize pain, Elena said flatly. I prefer to think of it as harnessing a natural human capacity for security purposes, he replied smoothly. If we understand how humans process and learn from pain, we can develop more effective training for high-stress situations. More humane interrogation techniques. Better rehabilitation for trauma survivors. Elena crossed her arms. And I suppose these humane interrogation techniques would be voluntarily tested? Harrington's smile tightened. Dr. Rodriguez, NeuroSynth is prepared to fund your research at 10 times your current budget. Complete autonomy. State-of-the-art facilities. Publication freedom. He slid a business card across the counter. Think about it. The opportunity to fully explore your theory without institutional constraints. As he turned to leave, he added, We'll be in touch soon. I hope you'll consider our offer carefully. After he left, Elena stared at the card in her hand, feeling as though she had just looked into the abyss. Her theory, that humans uniquely learn from pain rather than simply avoiding it, had never seemed more dangerous than in this moment. Elena couldn't sleep that night. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with implications she had never fully considered before. Her research had always been driven by pure scientific curiosity and the hope of helping trauma survivors. But now, faced with Harrington's thinly veiled suggestions, she was forced to confront the potential darker applications of her work. At 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and moved to her small balcony overlooking Mexico City. The metropolis hummed with distant traffic and flickering lights, millions of people living their lives, each carrying their own histories of pain and learning. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Who would be texting at this hour? Unknown number. Your research is more important than you know. NeuroSynth isn't what they seem. Meet me tomorrow. Café Azul, 2 p.m. Elena stared at the cryptic message. It could be a prank, a trap, or something else entirely. Yet something about it resonated with her own misgivings about Harrington and his company. The next day, Elena arrived at Café Azul 15 minutes early, choosing a table with a clear view of both the entrance and the rear exit. She ordered a coffee and waited, scanning each person who entered. At exactly 2 p.m., a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and alert eyes walked directly to her table and sat down without introduction. Dr. Rodriguez, she said quietly. Thank you for coming. My name is Dr. Isabel Vargas. How did you get my number? Elena asked. That's not important right now. What's important is that you understand what NeuroSynth really wants with your research. She leaned forward. I worked for them for 3 years in their neuroscience division. What began as a promising therapeutic program quickly evolved into something else entirely. What kind of something else? Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. They call it the Mnemosyne protocol, a method for directly manipulating how the brain processes traumatic experiences. Dr. Vargas's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her distress. Initially, it was meant to help PTSD patients. But then military contracts came in, and the focus shifted to creating what they termed enhanced interrogation resistance in operatives. Torture resistance training. Elena translated grimly.
Exactly.
And then, inevitably, they began exploring the reverse application, how to break that resistance in others. Elena felt sick. And my research? Your mapping of how humans transform pain into meaning gives them exactly what they need, a roadmap of the neural pathways they want to manipulate. With your methodology, they could potentially control not just how people respond to pain, but how they interpret their most fundamental experiences. Elena thought of Lucia, describing how her father's death had transformed her. That deeply human process of making meaning from suffering turned into a tool for control. I need proof, Elena said finally. I can't just take your word for this. Dr. Vargas nodded, as if she had expected this response. She slid a small drive across the table. Internal memos. Research protocols. Test results. I risked everything to get this out. She looked directly into Elena's eyes. They're watching you already. They won't take no for an answer. Your research is too valuable. What am I supposed to do? Abandon my life's work? Elena felt anger rising within her, at NeuroSynth, at this stranger for bringing her this information, at herself for not seeing the dangerous implications sooner. No, Vargas replied. I'm suggesting something much more difficult. Keep working, but work smarter. Find the truth in your research that they can't weaponize, the element that makes pain valuable rather than exploitable. As Vargas stood to leave, she added, and watch your back. Harrington isn't used to hearing no. Elena sat alone long after Vargas had gone, the untouched coffee growing cold before her. The drive felt heavy in her pocket, weighted with decisions yet to be made. For the next 3 weeks, Elena worked like a woman possessed. By day, she continued her official research at the university, careful to show progress but holding back critical insights. By night, she analyzed the files Vargas had given her and pursued a new angle, one that had been forming in her mind since their meeting. If humans were unique in learning from pain rather than merely avoiding it, there had to be a neurological basis for this difference. And if she could identify that basis, perhaps she could find a way to protect it from manipulation. Her apartment had become a chaotic second laboratory, with printouts covering every surface and multiple screens running analyses simultaneously. She had barely slept or eaten properly, running on coffee and adrenaline. On the 18th night, at 2:37 a.m., she found it. "That's impossible," she whispered to herself, staring at the results of her latest analysis. She ran the algorithm again and again. The same pattern emerged each time. The neurological difference between animal and human pain processing wasn't just in the prefrontal cortex, as she had initially theorized. It was in the interaction between three specific neural networks: the pain reception pathway, the narrative-creating language centers, and, most surprisingly, the default mode network, the part of the brain active during introspection and daydreaming. In animals, pain activated only the first network. In humans, it activated all three simultaneously, creating a unique feedback loop that transformed raw pain into meaningful experience. But the truly revolutionary discovery was that this three-part activation wasn't hardwired. It was learned. Early childhood experiences taught the human brain to connect these networks when processing pain. Cultural narratives about suffering, family responses to distress, early pain experiences, all shaped how an individual's brain would process pain throughout their life. "We're not born knowing how to learn from pain," Elena murmured, awestruck by the implications. "We're taught." This explained so much: why trauma survivors responded differently to similar experiences, why cultural attitudes towards suffering varied so dramatically, why some people seemed to grow through adversity while others were destroyed by it. And it meant that NeuroSynth's approach was fundamentally flawed. They were trying to manipulate a fixed system, but the system wasn't fixed. It was dynamic, shaped by countless variables beyond their control. Elena sat back, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. This discovery changed everything. It wasn't just scientifically significant, it was her leverage against NeuroSynth. If she could prove that pain processing was too complex and individually variable to manipulate reliably, their entire project would collapse. She needed more data, more subjects, more evidence. And she needed to move quickly before Harrington realized what she was doing. But first, she needed sleep. As she finally lay down, her phone buzzed with a text. "Unknown number. Progress report requested. Meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m. Your lab." Harrington wasn't asking. He was telling. Elena closed her eyes, mentally preparing for the chess game ahead. She had to appear cooperative while giving away nothing of true value. Her discovery remained her secret weapon for now. At precisely 10 a.m., James Harrington strode into Elena's laboratory as if he owned it. This time he came alone, no Dr. Santos, no university officials. Just Harrington, his expensive suit, and the cold calculation in his eyes. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said smoothly, "I hope the past few weeks have been productive." Elena had prepared carefully for this moment, arranging her lab to show clear progress while hiding her real breakthroughs. Screens displayed brain scan data, but not her most revealing findings. Research notes were visible but deliberately incomplete. "Mr. Harrington," she replied with professional courtesy. "Yes, we've made some interesting advances in understanding pain processing pathways." "Excellent." He smiled, revealing perfect teeth. "I've been reviewing your preliminary reports. Fascinating stuff. But I noticed you focused primarily on the prefrontal cortex. Have you explored connections to the limbic system? Our researchers believe that's where the real potential lies." The question was carefully crafted, both a test of her knowledge and a probe for information. Elena had anticipated this. "We're exploring multiple neural networks," she said, gesturing to a nearby screen showing standard brain mapping results. "The prefrontal limbic connection is certainly important, but our data suggests the relationship isn't as straightforward as previously thought." Harrington nodded thoughtfully, moving closer to examine the display. "And what about your theory regarding the uniquely human aspect of pain processing? Any developments there?" "Early days," Elena replied. "We're seeing some interesting patterns, but nothing conclusive yet." "I see." Harrington turned to face her directly. Dr. Rodriguez, while I appreciate methodical science, NeuroSynth operates on more accelerated timelines. We'd like to see more substantial progress. Quality research takes time, Mr. Harrington, especially when dealing with human subjects and complex neural processes. His smile tightened. Of course. And to help accelerate that quality research, NeuroSynth is prepared to make our formal offer now. He removed a document from his briefcase and placed it on her desk. Full funding, state-of-the-art facilities, a research team of your choosing, and, of course, generous compensation for yourself. Elena glanced at the document without touching it. And in return, exclusive rights to applications of your research. Your name on the publications, naturally. Full academic credit. We simply want first access to implementation. Implementation in what contexts, exactly? Harrington waved his hand dismissively. Therapeutic contexts, primarily. The details can be worked out once we have actionable results. Elena knew this was the moment to make a choice. She could play along, buying time while continuing her secret research. Or she could draw a line now. Mr. Harrington, she said carefully, before I could consider any offer, I need complete transparency about intended applications. My research has significant ethical implications. All groundbreaking science does, Doctor. His tone hardened slightly. And let's be frank, your funding situation here is precarious. The University Ethics Committee has concerns about your methodology. Several of your colleagues question your theoretical foundations. He paused meaningfully. We're offering you protection from all that, along with resources beyond anything academia can provide. So he had been gathering leverage. Elena felt a chill but kept her expression neutral. I appreciate the offer, but I'll need time to consider it properly. Of course. Harrington smiled again. All businessman. Take the weekend. We'll expect your answer Monday morning. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Dr. Rodriguez. I'd advise against discussing our offer with anyone, particularly with former NeuroSynth employees who might have distorted perspectives. Elena's blood ran cold. He knew about her meeting with Vargas. After Harrington left, Elena immediately checked her computer for signs of intrusion. Nothing obvious, but that didn't mean much against corporate espionage tools. Her phone, too, might be compromised. She needed to move her research somewhere secure. And she needed allies, people Harrington couldn't intimidate or buy. As she began methodically copying her most important files to an encrypted drive, Elena realized that her theory about pain and learning was being tested in her own life now. This crisis was painful, frightening, but what would she learn from it? What meaning would she create from this threat? The answer came to her with sudden clarity. This wasn't just about protecting her research anymore. It was about protecting the very human capacity that made the research valuable, our ability to transform suffering into meaning on our own terms. Elena knew she couldn't fight NeuroSynth alone. She needed allies with resources, influence, and courage. By Sunday afternoon, she had assembled an unlikely coalition in a small, technology-free cabin outside the city, a location chosen specifically because it couldn't be easily monitored. Around the rustic wooden table sat 5 people: Elena, Dr. Isabel Vargas, the NeuroSynth whistleblower, Professor Carlos Mendez, who had warned her about the company initially, Lucia Vega, whose personal story had helped confirm Elena's theory, and somewhat surprisingly, Dr. Gabriela Santos, the department chair who had seemed to support NeuroSynth's overtures. Thank you all for coming, Elena began, especially on such short notice and with so little explanation. Your message said it was urgent, Dr. Santos replied, and that it involved ethical violations at the highest level. Her expression was guarded but attentive. Elena nodded. It does. She turned to Lucia. And I want to apologize to you specifically, Lucia. Your participation in my research has unwittingly drawn you into something dangerous. I'm here because I want to be, Lucia said firmly. Your work helped me understand my own experience with loss. If someone is trying to misuse that, I want to help stop them. Elena took a deep breath and laid out everything: her original theory about human pain processing, NeuroSynth's interest, Dr. Vargas's warnings, and her recent discovery about the learned nature of the three-network pain processing system. So, you see, she concluded, what makes human pain processing unique isn't just neurological, it's cultural, personal, narrative-based. Pain becomes meaningful through complex interactions that can't be standardized or easily manipulated, which makes NeuroSynth's goal of weaponizing this process fundamentally flawed, Dr. Vargas added. But that won't stop them from trying and causing immense harm in the process. Professor Mendez leaned forward. What exactly do you think they plan to do with your research, Elena? Based on the files Dr. Vargas provided, they want to develop two technologies: one that enhances resilience to pain and trauma for military personnel, and another that essentially does the opposite, breaks down natural pain processing to make interrogation subjects more vulnerable. Mind control, essentially, Dr. Santos said quietly. Controlling how people interpret their own experiences.
Yes.
But my discovery complicates their plan. If pain processing is learned rather than hardwired, their one-size-fits-all approach won't work. Individual differences would be too great. But they don't know that yet, Lucia observed.
No.
And that's our advantage. Elena looked around the table. I have until tomorrow morning to give Harrington my answer. He's expecting me to accept their offer and hand over my research. Instead, I want to go public with everything, my findings, their plans, all of it. That's extremely risky, Dr. Santos cautioned. NeuroSynth has powerful connections in government and industry. They could destroy your career, or worse. Not if we have protection, Elena countered. That's where you come in, Dr. Santos. As department chair, you have connections to the National Science Ethics Committee. If we bring them this evidence preemptively, NeuroSynth can't simply bury it. Dr. Santos considered this. It would need to be handled very carefully. But yes, I could arrange an emergency hearing. And I still have contacts in scientific journalism, Professor Mendez added. Once the ethics committee is involved, we could ensure the story reaches the public regardless of NeuroSynth's influence. Dr. Vargas looked troubled. You're all underestimating how far Harrington will go. When I left NeuroSynth, they threatened my family. I've been living under a different name for the past year. A heavy silence fell over the group. Finally, Lucia spoke. My father died because someone fell asleep at the wheel. A preventable tragedy that destroyed my world. Her voice was soft but determined. For years, I thought that pain was meaningless, just random cruelty. Dr. Rodriguez's research helped me see that how we respond to pain defines us. If we let fear stop us now, what meaning does that create? Elena felt a surge of gratitude for this young woman who so perfectly embodied her theory. Lucia's right. And actually, this brings me to the final part of my plan. She outlined her strategy. They would prepare multiple releases of her complete research findings to the ethics committee, to selected journalists, to respected scientists in the field, and to open access research platforms. These releases would be triggered automatically if anything happened to any of them. Dead man's switch, Professor Mendez murmured. Smart. But more importantly, Elena continued, we're going to shift the narrative. My research isn't just about how humans process pain neurologically, it's about how we create meaning from suffering. That's something worth protecting from exploitation. Dr. Santos nodded slowly. A public campaign focused on preserving human autonomy in meaning-making. That's something people across the political spectrum could support. Exactly. And it makes NeuroSynth's project look not just unethical, but fundamentally anti-human. The group spent the next several hours refining their plan, assigning tasks, and establishing secure communication protocols. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Vargas pulled Elena aside. There's something you should know, she said quietly. When I left NeuroSynth, I didn't just take evidence of their unethical research. I also took data suggesting they've already begun preliminary testing of pain manipulation techniques. Elena felt cold. On whom? Officially on volunteers with PTSD. But some of the data suggests the subjects may not have fully understood what they were consenting to. We need to find them, Elena said immediately. Those people could be key witnesses. It's risky, but... Dr. Vargas hesitated. I might know where to start looking. As they rejoined the others, Elena felt both fear and resolve strengthening within her. Tomorrow's confrontation with Harrington would just be the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test her theory about pain and meaning in ways she had never anticipated. Monday morning arrived with a clarity Elena hadn't experienced in weeks. She had barely slept, but her mind was sharp, focused by the high stakes of what lay ahead. Her office was prepared exactly as she wanted it. Key research findings displayed on screens, backup data secured off-site, recording devices discreetly activated. Dr. Santos and Professor Mendez were positioned in the adjacent laboratory, ready to intervene, if necessary. Dr. Vargas remained in hiding, coordinating their external communications. And Lucia had insisted on being nearby as well, though Elena had made her promise to stay out of direct confrontation. At 9:58 a.m., James Harrington entered the laboratory, this time accompanied by two men in suits who positioned themselves near the door without introduction. Dr. Rodriguez, he said with a tight smile. I trust you've had sufficient time to consider our generous offer? I have, Elena replied calmly. And I've come to a decision based on some significant new findings in my research. She gestured to the nearest screen, which displayed her three-network theory. Please, let me show you. Curiosity overcame caution, and Harrington stepped closer to examine the display. Interesting. You've identified additional neural pathways involved in pain processing. More than that, Elena said, advancing to the next slide. I've discovered why human pain processing is fundamentally different from animal responses. It's not just about which brain regions activate, it's about how they interact and, most importantly, how those interactions are shaped by early experience and cultural context. Harrington's expression remained neutral, but Elena could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This three-network interaction, she continued, creates what we might call pain meaning, the uniquely human capacity to extract significance from suffering. But here's the crucial finding. This process isn't standardized. It varies dramatically between individuals based on their personal histories, cultural backgrounds, and countless other factors. Fascinating, Harrington said, though his tone suggested growing impatience. And how does this affect our arrangement? It means your project won't work, Elena stated bluntly. You can't develop a standardized method for manipulating how humans process pain because the process itself is too individualized. You might achieve results with specific test subjects, but you can't scale it as you're hoping to. Harrington's smile disappeared. That's a rather definitive statement, Dr. Rodriguez. Our research suggests otherwise. Your research is flawed, Elena countered. You've been working with a limited sample under artificial conditions. In the real world, with real trauma and real pain, the variables multiply exponentially. For a moment, tension hung in the air between them. Then Harrington sighed, as if disappointed by a child's poor performance. Dr. Rodriguez, while I appreciate your continued work, your conclusions are premature. NeuroSynth's resources will allow for much more extensive testing than you've been able to conduct here. He removed a folder from his briefcase. Now, regarding our agreement, I'm not signing anything, Elena interrupted. In fact, I'm declining your offer entirely. The change in Harrington was instant and chilling. His cordial facade vanished, replaced by cold calculation. That would be a serious mistake, he said quietly. Both professionally and personally. Are you threatening me, Mr. Harrington? Simply stating facts. Your research funding here is about to be reviewed. Several complaints have been filed regarding your experimental methods. And there are questions about the appropriate permissions for your after-hours use of university equipment. His smile returned, but never reached his eyes. Academic careers are fragile things, Dr. Rodriguez. Elena had expected this. Before you continue, you should know that complete documentation of my research, along with evidence of NeuroSynth's unethical testing protocols, has been secured with multiple trusted parties. If anything happens to me or my work, that information goes public immediately. Harrington's expression didn't change, but one of the men by the door shifted position slightly. Additionally, Elena continued, the National Science Ethics Committee has already received a preliminary report and has opened an investigation into NeuroSynth's human testing programs. That hit its mark. Harrington's composure fractured momentarily. You have no proof of any improper testing, he said sharply. Don't I? Elena advanced to the final slide, a data set she had extracted from Dr. Vargas's files. Subject 117. Military background. PTSD from combat experience. Enrolled in what was described as a therapeutic trial but was actually the first test of your mnemosony protocol. The subject experienced a complete psychological breakdown after your intervention failed to properly account for cultural and personal variables in pain processing. Harrington's face paled slightly. Those records were confidential and proprietary. Those records documented unethical human experimentation, Elena corrected. And there are more. Dr. Vargas was very thorough. At the mention of Vargas's name, Harrington's control finally slipped. That treacherous. He stopped himself, visibly regaining composure. Dr. Rodriguez, you're making accusations based on incomplete information provided by a disgruntled former employee. This is legally actionable slander. Perhaps. But I'm willing to take that risk. Elena stood taller, emboldened by the righteousness of her position. My research was never meant to be weaponized. It's about understanding how humans transform suffering into meaning, a process that should be protected. My research was never meant to be weaponized. It's about understanding how humans transform suffering into meaning, a process that should be protected, not exploited, Elena stated firmly. Harrington studied her for a long moment before responding. Noble sentiments, Doctor. But science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every discovery has applications, some benevolent, others less so. That's simply reality. Reality is what we make of it, Elena countered. Just like meaning is what we make of pain. And I'm choosing to make something different from my work than what you intend. The laboratory door opened suddenly, and Dr. Santos entered with Professor Mendez. Am I interrupting? Dr. Santos asked with deliberate calm. Harrington's eyes narrowed. We're having a private discussion. Actually, Dr. Santos replied, as department chair, I believe I should be present for any discussions regarding university research and external partnerships. She looked pointedly at Harrington's associates by the door. Especially when outside parties bring additional personnel into our facilities without authorization. The balance of power in the room had shifted. Harrington sensed it immediately. This isn't over, Dr. Rodriguez, he said quietly. NeuroSynth has invested considerably in pain processing research. With or without your cooperation, that work will continue. Perhaps, Elena acknowledged. But without understanding the full complexity of human pain meaning-making, your results will be fundamentally flawed. You'll waste millions pursuing a mirage. As Harrington and his men departed, Elena felt a momentary triumph followed by the sobering realization that she had made a powerful enemy. This wasn't the end, merely a reprieve. 3 months later, Elena sat in the austere chambers of the National Science Ethics Committee in Mexico City. The room was packed with journalists, academics, and representatives from various research institutions. Dr. Vargas sat beside her, having finally emerged from hiding to testify. At the center table, a former NeuroSynth test subject, a veteran identified only as Miguel, was describing his experience. They told me it would help process my war memories, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath. Instead, they disconnected something inside me. For weeks afterward, I couldn't feel anything about what I'd been through. No pain, but no meaning either. It was like my experiences belonged to someone else. The committee chair leaned forward. And how did this affect you, Miguel? I became lost. Without the pain, I couldn't find my way to healing. Pain has purpose. It connects us to what matters. He looked directly at Elena. Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand that. Her rehabilitation program reconnected those pathways they had severed. Elena had spent the past months developing therapeutic interventions for NeuroSynth's test subjects, helping them rebuild the neural connections that allowed them to process pain in meaningful ways. It was the most important application of her research she could imagine. When it was Elena's turn to speak, she approached the podium with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her purpose. What makes humans unique, she began, is not our capacity to avoid pain, but our ability to transform it. Through our research, we've discovered that this ability is neither fixed nor standardized. It's as diverse as humanity itself, shaped by culture, experience, and narrative. She displayed brain scans showing the 3-network activation pattern. This is what happens when we don't just feel pain, but make meaning from it. This is how grief becomes growth, how trauma becomes testimony, how suffering becomes significance. And this process must not, be manipulated or weaponized without destroying the very essence of what makes us human. 1 year later, Elena stood at the podium of the Universidad Nacional de Mexico's largest lecture hall, addressing the first international conference on pain, meaning, and human resilience. Researchers from around the world had gathered to share findings in this emerging field. In the front row sat Lucia, now a graduate student in Elena's new interdisciplinary program combining neuroscience, psychology, and cultural studies. Beside her was Miguel, who had become an advocate for ethical pain research and veteran rehabilitation. We began this journey with a simple observation, Elena told the audience. Humans are the only species that learns from pain, rather than merely avoiding it. What we've discovered since then is both more complex and more profound. We don't just learn from pain, we transform it. And in that transformation lies our greatest vulnerability and our greatest strength. She advanced to her final slide, showing comparison scans of her own brain, first from when she had remembered her childhood burn in the earliest days of her research, and then from her recent experience facing down Harrington and NeuroSynth. The same neural pathways activate, but with different patterns of connectivity. Different meanings emerge from different pains. The child learned caution from physical pain. The adult learned courage from ethical threat. Same brain, same capacity, different meanings, all uniquely human. As applause filled the hall, Elena caught sight of Dr. Vargas in the back, nodding with quiet approval. Their victory over NeuroSynth hadn't been complete. The company still existed, though under intense regulatory scrutiny and with its most unethical programs shut down. The broader battle to protect human autonomy in pain meaning-making continued. But something fundamental had changed in the scientific community's approach to pain research. Elena's work had helped create a new ethical framework that recognized pain processing as a human right to be protected rather than a neural pathway to be exploited. After the lecture, Elena found Lucia waiting for her. "I've been thinking about what you said about pain transformation," Lucia said. "My father's death will always be painful. But now that pain connects me to something larger than myself." Elena smiled, thinking of her abuela's words from so long ago. "Remember this feeling, Mija. Pain teaches us what words cannot." "We're the only species that learns from pain," Elena replied, "because we're the only species that creates meaning from it. And in that creation, we find not just knowledge, but wisdom." Outside, Mexico City stretched before them. Millions of lives intertwined in countless stories of pain and meaning, the most human story of all.